The fading light of dusk settled over the abandoned Hawthorne Manor, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn and weathered Victorian facade. The windows, like hollow eyes, stared vacantly into the distance, a silent testament to the family that once called this place home. This is where our story begins, in the quiet town of Harrow's Glen, Vermont, where the name Hawthorne still sends shivers down the spines of locals, even decades later. Welcome to Forgotten Whispers. I'm your host, and today we're delving into one of the most disturbing family histories ever documented, the macabre history of the Hawthornes. No one has seen the daughters since 1955. Before we begin, I must warn you, what you're about to hear isn't for the faint of heart. The tale of the Hawthorne family isn't just another disappearance case. It's a tapestry of bizarre occurrences, unsettling rituals, and a darkness that seems to have consumed an entire bloodline. Some of the locals I interviewed for this piece requested anonymity, their voices still trembling at the mere mention of the family name. The Hawthorne family first arrived in Harrow's Glen in 1889. Patriarch Alistair Hawthorne, a wealthy industrialist with a fortune amassed in textiles, purchased 50 acres of land on the outskirts of town. Within 2 years, he had constructed a sprawling Victorian mansion, complete with a central tower that loomed over the surrounding countryside like a watchful sentinel. The locals called it Hawthorne Manor, though in hushed whispers, some referred to it as the Crow's Perch, a nickname that would later seem eerily prophetic. Alistair wasn't alone when he arrived in Harrow's Glen. He brought with him his wife, Seraphina, a woman described in town records as possessed of unusual beauty and even more unusual quietude. The couple had 3 children, twin sons, Julian and Silas, and a daughter, Ilara. On paper, they appeared to be the quintessential, wealthy American family of the late 19th century. But appearances, as we know all too well, can be deceiving. The first indication that something wasn't quite right with the Hawthornes came in the winter of 1892. A local hunter venturing deeper into the woods than usual stumbled upon what he described as a circle of stones arranged with unnatural precision on the Hawthorne property. At the center of this circle was a shallow pit filled with what appeared to be animal bones and feathers. When questioned by curious townspeople, Alistair dismissed it as old Native American grounds that he had decided to preserve out of respect. The explanation satisfied most, but not everyone was convinced. Reverend Wallace Thorne, Harrow's Glen's parish priest at the time, wrote in his private journal, which was only discovered in 1977 during church renovations, that he had grave concerns about the Hawthorne family's spiritual well-being. He noted that while they attended Sunday services without fail, Seraphina would often be seen muttering words that were not prayers during communion. The Hawthorne children were enrolled in the local school, but they kept to themselves. Teachers noted that Ilara in particular displayed unusual knowledge of herbs and their properties for a child her age. The twins, Julian and Silas, were described as identical in appearance, but opposite in nature. Julian being outgoing and charming, while Silas was withdrawn and observed others with an intensity that made both children and adults uncomfortable. As the years passed, the Hawthornes became fixtures in Harrow's Glen. Though they remained somewhat apart from the community, Alistair expanded his business interest, opening a textile mill that employed many locals. This economic contribution made the family too important to ostracize, despite the growing sense that something wasn't quite right at Hawthorne Manor. In 1909, tragedy struck when Seraphina Hawthorne was found dead in the estate's garden. The official cause was listed as heart failure, though rumors persisted that her body had been discovered in strange circumstances, arranged in a position reminiscent of the stone circle found years earlier, surrounded by crow feathers. Within 6 months of his wife's death, Alistair remarried. His new bride, Isolde Vance, was a woman 20 years his junior, with no known family or connections in the area. Town records show she simply appeared in Harrow's Glen one day, taking a room at the local boarding house just 2 weeks before meeting Alistair at a charity function. By this time, the Hawthorne children were young adults. Alara had been sent to a finishing school in Europe and rarely returned home. The twins had joined their father's business, though Silas seemed to have a more ceremonial role, while Julian handled the day-to-day operations. With Isolde's arrival, the family dynamics shifted once again. Local historian Dr. Evelyn Reed, who has spent decades researching the Hawthorns, shared with me a disturbing pattern she discovered. After Isolde joined the household, there was a marked increase in missing persons reports in Harrow's Glen and surrounding towns, mostly young women, usually those without strong family connections. The authorities at the time never made a connection, but when you look at the geographical distribution and timeline of these disappearances, it's hard not to see a pattern centering around Hawthorne Manor. In 1914, Alistair Hawthorne died under circumstances that can only be described as bizarre. According to the coroner's report, he was found in his study, seated at his desk as if working. The cause of death was determined to be severe blood loss, yet there was no blood found at the scene. More disturbing still, his eyes had been removed with surgical precision. The official explanation was that Alistair had enemies from his business dealings, but no suspects were ever identified, and the case was eventually closed. With Alistair gone, ownership of the estate and business passed to Julian, the more socially adept of the twins. Silas continued to live at Hawthorne Manor, increasingly reclusive, while Isolde maintained her position as the lady of the house. Alara returned from Europe for her father's funeral, but left again shortly after, reportedly telling a childhood acquaintance that she couldn't breathe in that house anymore. The years between 1914 and 1930 saw the Hawthorne business thrive under Julian's guidance, despite the economic challenges of World War I and its aftermath. Julian married in 1922 a woman named Beatrice Croft from a respectable Boston family. They had 2 children, a son, Alistair II, born in 1923, and a daughter, Seraphina II, named after Julian's mother, born in 1925. Silas, meanwhile, remained unmarried and was rarely seen in town. Workers at the Hawthorne Mill whispered that he had taken over the tower room at the estate, and that strange sounds could be heard coming from it at night, chanting in an unknown language, and sometimes what sounded like the fluttering of countless wings. Isolde, now in her 40s, had developed a reputation as an eccentric. She was often seen wandering the grounds of Hawthorne Manor at odd hours, collecting plants and speaking to herself. She had also started a tradition of hosting an annual masquerade ball on the winter solstice, an event that, despite its opulence, left guests feeling unsettled. As one attendee from the 1927 ball wrote in a letter that's now part of the Harrow's Glen Historical Society's collection, the masks worn by the Hawthorns themselves were not like any I've seen before, crafted from what appeared to be actual bird skulls and feathers, with glass eyes that seemed to follow one around the room. I shan't be accepting their invitation next year. The Great Depression hit Harrow's Glen hard, but the Hawthorne textile business weathered the storm better than most. This resilience led to rumors that Julian had made deals with unsavory characters or had access to funds that others didn't. The truth, as revealed in business ledgers discovered during a 1980s tax audit, was more mundane but equally troubling. The Hawthorns had been systematically underpaying their workers and falsifying records to avoid regulation. In 1937, Silas Hawthorne disappeared. No formal missing persons report was ever filed. Julian simply informed the local authorities that his brother had gone abroad for his health. However, Silas's name never appeared on any passenger manifests leaving the country, and no correspondence from him was ever received. When pressed, Julian became agitated and insisted that his brother's whereabouts were a private family matter. It was around this time that locals began to report an increasing crow population around Harrow's Glen. The birds seemed to congregate particularly densely around Hawthorne Manor, sometimes darkening the sky above the estate in such numbers that it resembled dusk in the middle of the day. Wildlife experts brought in from Boston could offer no explanation for this unusual behavior. The 1940s brought World War II, and with it, a new chapter in the Hawthorne saga. Alistair II, now a young man, enlisted in the army and was deployed to Europe. Seraphina II, who had grown into a reserved young woman, very much in the mold of her grandmother and namesake, remained at Hawthorne Manor with her parents and Isolde, who by now was referred to by most townsfolk as Old Lady Hawthorne, despite there being no blood relation. In 1945, news reached Harrow's Glen that Alistair II had been killed in action during the final push into Germany. Julian and Beatrice were devastated, but witnesses reported that Isolde seemed almost pleased by the news. According to household staff, whose accounts were only shared decades later after they had left the Hawthornes' employ, Isolde was overheard telling Seraphina, "The suit now. The bloodline runs through you alone. The responsibility is yours." Following the war, Julian's health began to decline rapidly. By 1952, he was confined to his bed, suffering from what doctors described as a wasting disease of unknown origin. Beatrice devoted herself to his care, while Isolde took on more responsibilities in running the household. Seraphina II, now 27, had developed into a talented artist, though her subjects were exclusively birds, particularly crows, rendered in disturbing detail, often depicted in human-like poses or with human features. It was during this period that Seraphina II met Dr. Arlen Croft, a young doctor who had come to Harrow's Glen to establish a practice after serving as a military physician during the war. Their courtship was brief, and according to local gossip, not entirely approved of by Isolde. Nevertheless, they married in a small ceremony in 1953. The wedding was held at Hawthorne Manor rather than the town church, with only family and a few close friends in attendance. Within a year of their marriage, Seraphina II gave birth to twin girls named Alara and Isolde. The birth was not attended by a hospital physician, but was instead overseen by Isolde herself, with Arlen present in his capacity as a doctor. The twins were rarely seen in town, as Seraphina II became increasingly reclusive after their birth. In February 1955, Julian Hawthorne finally succumbed to his illness. His funeral was sparsely attended, as many of his business associates had either died or moved away, and the family had maintained their distance from the community. Beatrice, who had exhausted herself caring for her husband, fell ill shortly after the funeral and died within weeks. The official cause listed as pneumonia, though some suspected a broken heart. With Julian and Beatrice gone, ownership of Hawthorne Manor passed to Seraphina II and, by extension, Dr. Arlen Croft. This marked the first time in the estate's history that the Hawthorne name was not directly attached to its master. According to legal documents filed at the time, Arlen began making inquiries about selling the property and the now struggling textile business, which had failed to modernize after the war. This brings us to the central mystery of our story. On the morning of July 7, 1955, a fire broke out in the east wing of Hawthorne Manor, where the nursery was located. By the time the Harrow's Glen Volunteer Fire Department arrived, the wing was engulfed in flames. After the fire was extinguished, a grim search began for victims. The remains of Dr. Arlen Croft were found in the hallway outside the nursery, apparently having tried to reach the twins. Seraphina II's body was discovered in the master bedroom, though forensic evidence suggested she had died before the fire started. A deep cut across her throat indicated she had been murdered. Of Isolde and the twin girls, no remains were ever found. The official investigation concluded that Isolde had killed Seraphina II, set the fire, and fled with the twins. A manhunt was launched, but no trace of the elderly woman or the children was ever discovered. The case officially remains open, in the Harrow's Glen Police Department's files, though it hasn't been actively investigated in decades. But this is where the official record ends, and the legend of the Hawthorns truly begins to take shape. In the aftermath of the tragedy, as Hawthorne Manor stood partially burned and completely abandoned, strange stories began to circulate through Harrow's Glen. Some claimed to see lights moving in the undamaged portions of the house late at night. Others reported hearing the cries of children coming from the woods surrounding the estate. The most persistent stories, however, involved crows, massive gatherings of the birds that seemed to follow certain individuals around town, particularly those who spoke publicly about the Hawthorne case or expressed interest in purchasing the abandoned property. Former Harrow's Glen Police Chief Wallace Thorne, who was a junior officer at the time of the fire, shared with me his experiences before passing away in 2020. We had every available man searching those woods for weeks. There's no way an elderly woman and 2 infants could have vanished so completely. The dogs couldn't pick up a scent, which the handler said he was like nothing they'd ever experienced before. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist at the property line. Thorne paused at this point in our interview, looking troubled before continuing. There was something we found, though, that never made it into the official report. In the center of those woods, there was a clearing with a circle of stones, just like the one reported back in the 1890s. In the middle was a shallow pit with feathers, but not animal bones this time. They were human, infant-sized. The captain ordered us to fill it in and never speak of it again. Said it would cause a panic. Throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, several attempts were made to purchase and restore or demolish Hawthorne Manor. None were successful. Construction crews reported equipment failures, unexplained accidents, and workers refusing to return to the site after experiencing what they described as a feeling of being watched or hearing whispers that weren't quite human. In 1970, a developer from Boston finally managed to purchase the property at a fraction of its value. His plan was to demolish the house and build a modern subdivision. On the day demolition was scheduled to begin, the project foreman arrived to find every piece of equipment covered in crows, hundreds of them sitting silently, watching. When the birds were scared away and work commenced, the wrecking ball operator suffered a sudden heart attack. His replacement refused to continue after claiming to see a woman in old-fashioned clothes standing in an upstairs window of the house they were about to demolish. The developer eventually abandoned the project, citing environmental concerns and structural issues that made development impractical. The property reverted to the county due to unpaid taxes. Throughout the 1970s, Hawthorne Manor became a magnet for thrill seekers and paranormal enthusiasts. Many reported disturbing experiences, watches stopping at precisely 3:33 a.m., cameras malfunctioning, and the overwhelming sense of being followed after leaving the property. Several visitors were later involved in unusual accidents, often involving incidents where they were attacked by birds in seemingly coordinated assaults. In 1977, a group of graduate students from Arkham Ridge University's anthropology department conducted an unauthorized overnight stay at the estate as part of a study on local legends. Only 3 of the 5 students returned. The missing 2 were never found, despite extensive searches. The survivors refused to discuss what happened, and one later committed suicide, leaving behind a note that read only, "They're watching through the crow's eyes. They've always been watching." By the 1980s, local authorities had fenced off the property and posted no trespassing signs, though this did little to deter the curious. The partially burned mansion had deteriorated significantly, with the roof collapsing in several areas and nature reclaiming much of the structure. Yet strangely, the central tower remained intact, seeming to defy the ravages of time and weather. In 1985, on the 30th anniversary of the fire, the Harrow's Glen Gazette ran a feature story on the Hawthorne mystery. The reporter, Amelia Crane, had spent months researching the family history and interviewing anyone with connections to the case. Her article suggested that the Hawthorns had been involved in an ancient cult with roots in pre-Christian Europe, and that the disappearances and deaths associated with the family were part of a multi-generational ritual culminating in the 1955 incident. Crane cited anonymous sources claiming that both Serafina and Isolde Hawthorne had been practitioners of a form of witchcraft focused on transformation and rebirth through avian vessels. Essentially, the transfer of human consciousness into birds, particularly crows. The article was dismissed by most as sensationalism, but it rekindled interest in the case and led to a brief reopening of the investigation, which yielded no new findings. 2 weeks after the article was published, Amelia Crane was involved in a car accident when, according to witnesses, a sudden swarm of birds flew directly at her windshield, causing her to lose control and drive off a bridge. Her body was never recovered from the river below. Throughout the 1990s, the legend of the Hawthorns continued to evolve. Urban explorers who ventured onto the property reported finding strange symbols carved into trees and stones, concentric circles with what appeared to be a stylized bird at the center. Several claimed to have found old photographs or documents in the decaying mansion, but curiously, none of these items ever seemed to leave the property. Anyone who claimed to have taken such evidence would later discover their pockets or bags empty. In 1999, a Hollywood production company announced plans to make a film based on the Hawthorne case. Pre-production began with scouts visiting Harrow's Glen to photograph the estate and surrounding areas. Within months, the project was quietly canceled. No official explanation was given, but industry insiders reported that several key members of the production team had quit after experiencing disturbing dreams, featuring twin girls with eyes like black marbles who spoke in unison. As we entered the new millennium, interest in the Hawthorne case waned somewhat, becoming just another regional ghost story, albeit one with unusually persistent and consistent details across decades of tellings. The estate continued to crumble, though as mentioned earlier, the central tower remained oddly well preserved. In 2010, a significant discovery was made when the Harrow's Glen Historical Society was cataloging documents donated by the family of a former mill worker. Among ledgers and pay stubs was a journal belonging to Silas Hawthorne, apparently hidden by the worker who had found it shortly before Silas's disappearance in 1937. The journal was written in a cipher that took historians months to decode, and even then, much of it remained unintelligible. The passages that were decoded painted a disturbing picture. Silas wrote of the covenant made by Alistair with those who watch from above, and a promise that the seventh generation shall complete the transformation. He referred repeatedly to something called the Black Pinnacle, which scholars believe was his name for the ritual his family had been working toward for decades. Most disturbingly, Silas wrote, "Isolde is not what she appears. She has been with us much longer than anyone knows. I have seen her change her face as easily as one might change a mask. She is the keeper of the knowledge, guiding each generation toward our ultimate purpose." The journal also contained detailed drawings of anatomical studies comparing human and avian structures, with notations about points of spiritual transference and vessels of consciousness. The final dated entry from just days before Silas's reported disappearance read, "I cannot complete my transformation yet. The bloodline must continue to the seventh, but I have seen what awaits us, and it is glorious. Until then, I will watch and wait with the others." In 2017, the county finally approved the demolition of Hawthorne Manor, citing public safety concerns. The night before work was to begin, a severe storm hit Harrow's Glen, with lightning striking the central tower multiple times. By morning, the entire structure had collapsed in on itself, leaving little more than a pile of rubble for the demolition crew to clear away. During the cleanup process, Workers discovered a sealed room in what had been the cellar beneath the tower. Inside was a collection of unusual artifacts, bird cages of various sizes, including some large enough to hold a human, books in languages that linguists have struggled to identify, and most unsettlingly, a set of child-sized clothes laid out as if waiting for their owners to return. Clothing that, based on the style, would have belonged to young girls in the early 1950s. Also found in this room was a large circular mirror with a frame carved to resemble intertwined crows. The glass was unusually dark, and several workers reported feeling dizzy or experiencing momentary hallucinations when looking into it. The mirror was sent to a university laboratory for analysis, but it was apparently lost in transit. The delivery truck was found abandoned on a rural road, its driver missing, and the cargo area empty, except for crow feathers scattered across the floor. This brings us to more recent developments. In 2020, a woman named Corinne Thorne came forward, claiming to be a distant relative of the Hawthorns through a previously unknown branch of the family. She petitioned the court for ownership of the property, presenting documentation that genealogists confirmed appeared authentic, if unusually well preserved for their age. Corinne was described by those who met her as strikingly beautiful but unsettling, with one county clerk noting that her eyes seemed wrong somehow, too dark and too knowing. Her petition was granted, and she announced plans to build a memorial garden on the site to honor her family's history. Construction began in early 2021, but was soon halted when workers uncovered what appeared to be human remains while excavating for the garden's foundation. Forensic analysis determined the bones belonged to at least 12 individuals, most of them female, with deaths dating back to the early 1900s, corresponding with the disappearances that historian Dr. Evelyn Reed had previously linked to Hawthorne Manor. The discovery prompted a criminal investigation during which Corinne Thorne disappeared. Authorities searching her temporary residence found it completely empty, not just of her belongings, but of any evidence that anyone had lived there at all. The lease had been paid in cash, and the identification she had used to establish her identity was determined to be expertly forged. More disturbingly, security camera footage from nearby businesses showed Thorne leaving her home on the night of her disappearance. But in every frame, her face was obscured by what appeared to be a technical glitch, a dark smudge that technicians could not explain or remove during enhancement attempts. Today, the former site of Hawthorne Manor is cordoned off as an active crime scene, though locals report that police activity has dwindled in recent months. The investigation appears to have stalled, with no new leads on Corinne Thorne's whereabouts or the identities of most of the recovered remains. What continues unabated, however, is the presence of crows. Harrow's Glen now hosts one of the largest crow populations in New England, with the birds seeming to concentrate particularly around the former Hawthorne property and following certain individuals around town, especially those connected to the investigation or who speak publicly about the case. Local ornithologist Dr. Quentin Bell has been studying this phenomenon for the past 3 years. These aren't normal migratory or feeding patterns, he explained during our interview. These birds appear to be organized in a way that defies our understanding of corvid behavior. They seem to communicate with purpose and demonstrate what I can only describe as targeted surveillance of specific humans. Dr. Bell showed me footage he had captured of the crows gathering in the shape of what appeared to be 2 small human figures when viewed from above, a formation they maintained for nearly 20 minutes before dispersing. "I'm a scientist," he said, "and I deal in observable facts. What I've observed here defies rational explanation within our current understanding of animal behavior." Perhaps most chilling are the reports that began emerging in 2022 of twin girls seen at the edges of the woods surrounding the former estate, always described as around 5-6 years old, wearing old-fashioned dresses with unusually dark eyes and often accompanied by crows. They never speak to witnesses, but are said to watch intently before retreating into the trees when approached. These sightings have been dismissed by authorities as urban legend and the power of suggestion, but their consistency across unrelated witnesses is noteworthy. Child psychologist, Dr. Isabel Garcia, who interviewed several of the witnesses, told me, "These aren't people who knew each other or had shared their stories before reporting their experiences, yet they all described the same details: the girls' matching appearance, their stillness, the way they seemed to communicate without speaking, and most notably, the way the crows seemed to respond to their presence, forming a protective circle around them." The last official statement from the Harrow's Glen Police Department regarding the Hawthorne case came in early 2023, when Chief Michael Donovan told reporters, "While we continue to investigate the human remains found on the property, we have no evidence connecting these findings to the events of 1955 or the recent disappearance of Corinne Thorne. We ask the public to respect the ongoing investigation and remind everyone that trespassing on the property remains prohibited." Unofficially, however, officers seem reluctant to patrol the area, particularly after dark. One officer, speaking on condition of anonymity, shared, "We draw straws for that assignment. Nobody wants it. You feel watched the entire time, and the radio never works properly near that property. Just static and what sounds like children's voices whispering just below the threshold of understanding." So what are we to make of the macabre history of the Hawthorne family? Is it merely a tragic series of events that has grown into local legend through decades of retelling? Or is there something more sinister at work? A multi-generational plan that reached its culmination in 1955, but continues to echo into the present. The facts we know for certain are these. The Hawthorne family arrived in Harrow's Glen in 1889 and established themselves as influential but isolated members of the community. Over decades, they were associated with unusual practices, unexplained disappearances, and deaths under suspicious circumstances. In 1955, a fire destroyed part of their estate. Serafina, the second Hawthorne Croft, was murdered. Her husband Arlen died in the fire, and Isolde Vance vanished along with twin girls, Elara and Isolde Croft, who would be in their early 70s today, if still alive. No trace of Isolde or the twins was ever found, despite extensive searches. Human remains discovered on the property in 2021 suggest a pattern of killings associated with the estate going back to the early 1900s. Corinne Thorne, claiming to be a Hawthorne descendant, disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 2021. And sightings of twin girls who never age continue to this day. What we cannot explain through conventional means is the persistent connection to crows, the seemingly impossible preservation of the central tower until its sudden destruction. The missing journal pages that Silas Hawthorne claimed detailed a transformation, and the unnaturally consistent patterns of strange occurrences over more than a century. If we are to believe Silas's decoded writings, the Hawthornes were working towards something called the Black Pinnacle, a ritual meant to be completed by the 7th generation. By traditional counting, the twin girls born in 1954 would represent the 4th generation of Hawthornes in Harrow's Glen. Alastair, Julian, Serafina, the second, the twins. However, if we consider Isolde as having been with them much longer than anyone knows, as Silas suggested, the generational count becomes unclear. As I conclude this investigation, I find myself reflecting on something Dr. Bell said during our interview. In mythology across cultures, crows and ravens are often seen as messengers between worlds, psychopomps guiding souls to the afterlife. But what if that relationship works both ways? What if they can also bring something back? Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is not that the Hawthorne twins vanished without a trace in 1955, but that they never left at all, that they remain in Harrow's Glen, unchanged by time, watching through the eyes of crows and occasionally appearing at the edge of the woods as a reminder that some family legacies never truly end. For Forgotten Whispers, this has been the story of the Hawthorne family. Sleep well tonight, and if you hear tapping at your window, it's probably just the wind. Probably. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe for more historical mysteries and unexplained phenomena. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the Hawthorne case, but perhaps think twice before saying their name too many times. After all, the crows are always listening. Until next time, remember, some histories are better left undisturbed.